Very, very warm welcome to all of you who are participating here today with us for a very interesting webinar. On behalf of all of us, Dr. Louiza Rodrigues, an old and dear friend of the Museum Society and of several of us who are here this evening, and a colleague of many of us as well. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Louiza, on behalf of the chairman and the trustees of the CSMBS, on behalf of the Executive Committee of the Museum Society, on behalf of our beloved Director General, Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, and on my own behalf, I'm really delighted that you accepted the offer of the Godrej Archives, who are our co-hosts this evening, to join us and be with us and deliver what is going to be a very, very fascinating subject. Dr. Louiza is going to speak to us on timber trade trajectory, the urbanization of Bombay and deforestation of Western India, 19th century. And today's paper, just a brief abstract of what she's going to speak about, so we are familiar with what's coming up this evening. Dr. Louiza Rodrigues is going to discuss the natural resources of Western India, which were valuable in shaping the urban environment of Bombay, especially timber forests that were under territorial subjugation of the British, who eventually made it their prized commodity. And I hand you over to the speaker for this evening, and before that to Brinda Patari from Goldridge Archives to give her introduction and welcome. Over to you, Brinda.
Thank you, Dr. Firoza Godrej, and thank you everyone at the Museum Society of Mumbai and SIN and CSMBS for collaborating with us for this series of Thursday talks that we initiated in this pandemic year. So good evening, everyone. And before we proceed, let me quickly inform you about Godrej Archives. So conceived in 1997, Godrej Archives was formally started in 2006. It is a corporate archive preserving the history of 123-year-old Godrej group of companies, and we archive histories of its product, manufacturing plants, and people, and we are making it available for research as well. To encourage research in business history, we have also started research fellowships and scholar in residence programs since 2018. And Godrej Archives works along with historians, writers, designers to reinvent the new meaning about the past, and we strive to communicate this history through exhibitions, publications, art installations, and talks like these. So to continue this dialogue that we had started in 2006 and reach out even during the pandemic, face-to-face interactions are impossible, we started this series of online Thursday talks in collaboration with the Museum Society and the CSMBS. And today I feel especially very honored to welcome Dr. Louiza Rodrigues as a speaker for our fourth Thursday talk. And she has been my professor at Ramnarain Ruia College when I was pursuing BA. And she was the one who actually kept me inspired about learning history throughout my student career. And today I'm really very pleased to again switch on that student mode as she would delve into the British policy that regulated timber trade and appropriated the forest, which eventually actually adversely affected the forest and the timber merchants. So I'm really looking forward, Dr. Rodrigues, and over to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, very good evening to all. I would like to thank Dr. Firoza Godrej for the generous introduction. I'm extremely grateful to Godrej Archives, the chairperson, Dr. Firoza Godrej, and chairperson also of Chhatrapati Shivaji Museum Society of Mumbai, the trustees, the executive committee, and Brinda Patare, my very dear student, who is the chief archivist at Godrej Archives, for giving me this, and the entire organizing team, the technical team, for giving me this wonderful opportunity to present a paper which is so on the topic which is so dear to my heart, the timber trade tragedy, urbanization of Bombay and deforestation of Western India in the 19th century. So I will share my screen here. So although historians in India have shown an increasing interest in environmental history in recent years, There are very few works which seriously examine the root cause of deforestation. My paper today provides an antidote to the existing historiography which barely takes into account the timber trade in the 19th century Western India. The major focus of my paper today is one of the main aspects of deforestation, that a forest, that deforestation of Western India, that was postulated in 3 phases as a result of physical infrastructure projects undertaken by the colonial British state. The paper introduced some fascinating vignettes regarding the vibrant timber trade, the trading networks, other trade-related features which led to infrastructural development of Bombay. It also delves into the policy of the British towards forest resources like timber, their policy in regulating timber trade, appropriating the forest, and establishment of the monopoly of forest, and subsequently its impact on the forest. Now, this study argues for 3 particular effects of British colonialism on the forest in Western India. First, the colonizer, that is the British colonial state, promoted an economic system that required intensive forest resource exploitation for infrastructural development like building ships, housing, civic construction, that is travelers' bungalows within Bombay, and finally the establishment of the railways and extension of the railways in Bombay Presidency and the furniture making industry. Secondly, you find it argues that the British built the knowledge system of the forest of India to forest surveys, that is reconnaissance missions, enabling them to monopolize, appropriate, and exploit and reconstruct and transform the forest of Western India without any concern for the people, the local merchants, and the tribal. And thirdly, it argues that the magnitude of deforestation of Western India certainly increased as a result of the British rule. Now, I was fortunate to really come across very good primary sources from which was culled from the Maharashtra State Archives in the form of files and in the form of the several volumes in the Public Works Department, Railway, Department, the Public Department, the Political Department, Revenue Department, and also the Marine Department, especially when it comes to the maritime industry. And not only that, even the forest reports of the conservators were very much important to enable us to find out the perspectives, of the British towards the forest policy. Yeah. So by 1800, what you see is Bombay emerged as an important port and a commercial center on the west coast of India under the British rule. Several infrastructural projects were undertaken by the state in the 19th century, with the construction of the warship, which began in 1800, and subsequently the other warships and commercial ships, public and private buildings, bungalows, furniture which adorned the houses of the elites, both the Europeans, the British, as well as the Indians, and the extension of the railways in the Bombay and erstwhile Bombay Presidency. Now, timber became the most important commodity for these infrastructural development projects. A variety of timber was used, especially teak and other species of timber like blackwood, jackwood, babul, ain, irul, and many other such timber. And timber was drawn for namely 4 states, that is Malabar, which is present-day Kerala, Kannada, that is present-day Karnataka, Gujarat, and Maharashtra, that is basically Basin and the Konkan regions. So since timber became the most important commodity, the perception of the British colonial state towards the forest began to change radically in the 19th century, and because it became the major asset of the company. Paradoxically, this urbanization process resulted in deforestation, which took place in 3 phases, and subsequently you see the decline also in this vibrant trade by the end of the 19th century. So next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So before beginning with the warships, that is in 1800, shipbuilding in Bombay had begun in the mid-18th century. This is also, you see, coincide with the decline of Surat and the rise of Bombay. Since this was one of the most important industries from both commercial as well as from strategic point of view, you find ships came to be built of timber, and everything was constructed of timber. As I said, that's how it was, and therefore the goal of the state was to gain control of the forest, which resulted in the process of internal territorialization. Now, beginning in the 19th century. So internal territorialization is understood here as a political process of establishing control over the forest resources and behavior within the states through the articulation and enforcement of access and usage right. So what it meant in practice was a progressive deepening and extension of knowledge of forest by conducting surveys and mapping. The state gained access to these forests and control them at an increasingly local level, but at the same time enhancing centralized management. So realizing the importance of this maritime industry for both for commercial and strategic purpose, Louiza Rodrigues, Parsis were known as good cabinet makers. So you all know that Parsis basically where they had settled in Surat, and they were good cabinet makers, they were good furniture makers, and therefore Louiza and Indians were also known for building ships. It is not that the British who introduced shipping, they were very well known for building ships. Tipu Sultan had constructed also many ships. So you find that in 1735, Louiza Rodrigues, Nasarvanji Rodrigues was called to Bombay to construct the ships at the naval dockyard. So you have the development of the naval dockyard. Bombay is seen as a safer haven here. Not only that, you find it better than Surat, and what you see is also that good for harbor. And therefore, you find Louiza known for his craftsmanship, Nasarvanji Rodrigues, in shipbuilding. He utilized his expertise, European technology, Indian raw material, that is timber, and he built good ships during the 40-year tenure of master ships. He built around 20 ships for the East India Company and 14 merchant vessels, most of them weighing 200 tons. But these ships were small and ranging with the guns of 6 to 10 guns. So they were nearly not really big warships, okay? And they were small ships. So the next slide. Next slide. Yeah. The turning point in the history of shipbuilding comes in 1800. And there were two reasons for it. One is there was this fear of Napoleon Bonaparte invading India. So the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte as a great ruler whose ambition was not only to conquer the all parts of the world, and he wanted to become the master of the world, you find there was fear of this threat, and the British really wanted to build ships. But the question was, were they in a position in England to build the ships made of timber, because oak was depleted? In England being the mother of the Industrial Revolution, you find urbanization process begins much earlier and the oak is depleted. And therefore, there was no other alternative for the British but to depend upon the Indian timber to construct ships for their navy. So this was the reason why you find that in 1300, a frigate. So the next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So this is what a frigate named Cornwallis, weighing 1,363 tons with 50 gun, was built by Jamshedji Bomanji and launched by the British for the first time at the Bombay dockyard. The ship was so beautifully constructed and of such great strength that it was purchased by the Admiralty, and this warship set a precedent for building many other ships. Next, yeah. So, Indians, knowing that how they had to undergo such racial insults, so it was inscribed. It was constructed by D.D. Blackfellow, 1800. Next slide. Next, yeah. So this was the ship where they decided to construct the Minden of 74 guns, and to build such warship required quite a lot of timber. So next slide. So what strategies were adopted by the British in, so next. in extracting timber from the forest of West India. Next slide. Yeah. So forests were of three types. Privately, no, go back. Private, back. Yeah. So forests were of three types: privately owned, government forest, and village community forest. And certain areas of forest, all the village community had forest under their control. Now, the British, certainly what they found was through their surveys, reconnaissance mission which they carried out, the good quality timber which was available and the straight timber which was required for shipbuilding and such warship was in Malabar. In fact, they carried out experiments, and what you see is that when they carried it, they found out that Tipu Sultan ship can last for more than 100 years, which is not so, which is ships which were constructed of oak. And therefore, certainly Malabar became the target of to extract timber from this forest. Moreover, it was very sturdy, the density it was good, and it was resistant to white ants. And therefore, you find the districts of Kerala, that is the Malabar, and then the next district, that is the territory of Kerala, Kannada, that is Karnataka, on the west coast of India, certainly became very important for the British. So what did the British do first? So they became a coveted property. It became a coveted property as far as the timber is concerned from Malabar, and in next is Karnataka, especially from Malabar. So first, what the strategy which was adopted was, you find Malabar and Kannada was acquired by the British in March 1792 when a treaty was signed by Tipu Sultan. And after acquiring these territories, the first thing that the British did, the next slide. Yeah. They established sovereignty over Malabar. So even though the territory was taken over and the treaty was signed, you find the forest of Malabar and Kannada were brought under the Bombay government, okay, in 1808. And second thing what they did was, in 1806, the first conservator of forest was appointed. See, till 1847, there is no forest department. Forests were under political department, military department, revenue department. The British paid really scant attention to environment of forests for that matter. It was important, but scant attention to establish a department. So what they did at the most was appointed a conservator, that is Joseph Watson was appointed, and his role was to ensure that he conserved the trees, that nobody flouts, the regulation which they passed in 1807, where they established the monopoly over tea. So, they literally, this proclamation annihilated the private trade. Nobody could indulge in the private trade. The British established the monopoly of the timber trade, and anybody was caught, in violating this terms and caught of extracting timber, either by robbing or anything, the conservator had the right to punish it. So that's how you find that a variety of timber was, can you go back to the previous slide? So a variety of timber was required for different parts of the ship. If you see that generally the hard and sturdy woods were required. So you have these sturdy woods for the keel and heel, the base. You find hard and sturdy wood, which they could find it only basically from Malabar. But the light wood which was required for the superstructure. So the next slide. Now, forest reconnaissance mission. Now, what did they do? So, as I mentioned, how how you find the forest territory becomes very important, how surveys become important, the knowledge become important. So, we talk about archives today, but British were able to maintain this sophisticated way. They were able to create the archives of the trees existing in the entire part of the Western India, the forest of Western India, archiving it, making use of it for infrastructural development in Bombay. So thus begins the Reconnaissance mission. okay, which were conducted, no, earlier, which were, yeah, okay, fine. Forest Reconnaissance Mission, which was conducted in different parts of Western India. They began with the Malabar forest. And if you see, can you take up the next slide? Next slide. Yeah. So that's how you find the surveys were carried out in Malabar. These were the forests which were explored in different regions, Karnataka, Gujarat, as well as you find even the Konkan and the Basin region. Next slide. Next slide. Now the British decided to classify the timber, like which, because ultimately the good quality timber was required for the straight timber, especially for the ship, the base of the ship. So you find the first sort was the superior quality timber, which was 40 feet in length and 8 candies could be procured from one particular tree. And this was the tree which grew to the 860 to 100 years, almost 100, you can say 120 years. Second sort was 30 feet in length and 3.3.5 candies could be procured. And these were the trees which could be cut for as far as 25 to 60 years. These trees were at that particular years. And the third sort was 15 feet in length, which was 1 to 2.5 candies could be procured. And these were younger trees, 1 to 25 years. Next. Now, since all the timber could not be procured from the Malabar region, other regions also, as I mentioned earlier. Now, this is how the archive that was created. It gives you minute, the reports which were submitted and who conducted the surveys, basically the military people, the engineers who went into the forest. And it was not very easy task, going into the dense jungles. Of course, they equipped themselves well. And although it was a little easy as far as Malabar and Kannada forest, but it was not so very easy when it came to Gujarat forest. So as far as the Gujarat forest is concerned, they had the difficulty in going in the Dang region, which was dominated by the Beals. And in the first, what can say, their journey, the British were killed. So as usual, the British, how diplomatic they were, they made use of, they approached the Gaikwad ruler and he provided some local inhabitants. And that's how they succeeded in, getting into lease agreement from Khandesh, as far as even the Bhil tribes of supplying the timber to the company. So yeah. So you have this is how the archive was created. As I said, the statistical data is given, which timber trees are fit to cut, which are not too fit to cut. So this is how the timber districts of Malabar. Yeah, next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so this is are the teak trees. You are, as I mentioned later on, I talk about the Blackwood tree also, which was used. Next. Yeah, next. It's very interesting to know that the collector, Bombay, had carried out a survey of the trees in Salsette in 1810, and one can really see that you have these trees like in Thane. You have this the first sort, second sort, third sort. These many trees were available in Godbandar. You have these many trees available. Malad, which I come from, had 2,140 trees. Marol had, so Marol, which includes even the RA today. So that's why the number of trees are more. And that's only lungs of Mumbai, I feel, which survives today. So we can't afford to lose RA at all. So 9,424 trees. And that's how you have the total number of trees were around 10,322. 32 trees as far as the third sort, first sort, and second sort. Next. Yeah. So, what were the now I'll take you to as far as the trans-regional timber trade in Bombay, that is Bombay, Malabar, Bombay, Karnataka, Bombay, Gujarat, Basin, and Konkan. So, after obtaining the data about this valuable timber, the company advertised in newspapers, and they invited tenders for the same, describing the size of the ship and a detailed description about the quantity and quality of timber required for the marine. And so thereafter, the company entered into a contract with the merchants, whichever tenders were low or in the favorable terms. But for larger consignment of timber, the British government used the so-called European agency houses like Bruce, Fawcett and Company, Forbes and Company, who becomes a vital link between the government and the timber merchants. But nobody could fell a tree, nobody could go into the forest without the permission of the East India Company. So that's how the license, the East India Company had to, any contractor who wanted to indulge into this trade, any timber merchant, they had to take a permission, they had to obtain a license, and that's how the East India Company maintained their monopoly rights as far as the timber is concerned. So the system that that they adopted was the contract system. So contract system becomes the modus operandi for the construction, for the extraction of the trees or the forest in Western India. And then the contractor, after obtaining license, purchase the right to fell the tree of the forest from the government, and then obtain the permit for the same from the owner and hired people to cut the tree. So when he hired the people to cut the tree, he paid 1 rupee per tree. The selection of wood was the primary preoccupation of the contractor, who had to supply seasoned timber. So what do you mean by seasoned timber? You have, once the timber is trees are cut, it had to, walk, it had to dry it up. So it took some months, sometimes years to dry it up, and then it was dragged by the laborers from the forest, if it was the interior of the forest, to the rivers, and then it was floated down the river to the sea coast and exported to Bombay, usually in the month of December, January, or February. Okay, and if you see that the next slide, the transportation. See, in Malabar and Canara, that is Karnataka, that is, elephants were used. And why elephants were used? Basically because labor was very expensive. Imagine a straight timber and such a log of wood, to be transported from the jungles required many people. So elephants were any day better to transport this timber. And when it comes to in the northern region, you find timber from Basin, Kalyan and Bhiwandi. They were brought through Thana river to Bombay, and there you find the main transportation was basically bullock carts. So in Gujarat, you find bullock carts, oxen were used to transport the timber from the jungle. And then the rivers plays an important role. As you know, that the only mode of transportation that was available was through sea and the ships. Okay, the shipbuilding had begun, and so the botelas were used, the ships were used to transport this particular timber. So rivers become very important. In Malabar, it was the Bepur River, and you find Kaveri River. In northern region, you find it was brought to the Thane River, and that's how you find transportation was done. Yeah, next. So most of the demands of the dockyard were met basically from the Malabar coast. In the year 1799 itself, 10,000 teak trees were brought down from the Bepur River, which was the produce of several years, which enabled the construction of this particular ship in 1800, the Cornwallis. And then you find timber was sent to the sawmills and then converted into planks. So if you see the prices of timber in the period in the early 19th century, the Bombay government was supplied with timber. Malabar, the teak, which was the most superior and good quality, it was 14 to 16 rupees per candy. Calicut timber, it was called the Calicut timber, of the first sort. For the second sort, it was 10 to 12 rupees, and the third sort was 9 to 10 rupees. And the timber plank costed around 30 rupees. Now, the British, you find that they were able to build these ships, and you find beginning from Nasirvanji Wadia, and if you see between 1810 to 1820, 13 vessels were built. But even before building the ships, the British, in order to establish a firm monopoly, you have in course of time, the British, in order to annihilate the private trade, the colonial state gave the monopoly right to one person. Imagine, Chakura Musa was the leading merchant of the Malabar coast, and he took advantage of the situation, and it was his duty to see to it that timber was supplied to the East India, to the Bombay dockyard. So you find that, of course, this did affect the merchants, the tribal people, it did affect the local people also, because it affected the merchants, especially of the coastal, and it annihilated their trade, because now it was one person who was dominating the trade. So you find merchants, objecting to it in the form of petition, which was British to it. So you find, as I mentioned to you, Malabar, if you see annually, beginning of the 19th century, 1600 to 2000, almost 1,600 to 2,000 candies was supplied annually to the company in the early 19th century. So you can imagine the extent of timber. And from the advertisement, I could make, I calculated that to build one ship, warship, as such, it required 936 timber trees were cut. So you can imagine the extent of deforestation as a result of building ships, especially the warships. Yeah. Next. So the next infrastructural project was public buildings, housing, bungalows, furniture making industry, which took a toll of forest. So if shipbuilding consumed the enormous quantity of timber, the civic construction in the early 19th century greatly contributed to the denudation of forest of Western India. Urbanization of Bombay was greatly linked to the timber resources of Western India. Once again, the eye was on teak. Teak became one of the most important components in the construction of houses, bungalows, and public buildings, in travelers' bungalows, and so on, in Malabar, as well as also in the periphery. Okay, so in hill station, Mahabalipuram hill station, and so on. And despite of the fact, in the early 19th century, in 1803, there is a great fire, you find, and the town committee is established to persuade the people not to construct houses of timber, yet houses came to be constructed. In the early 19th century, you also see the buildings which were public buildings. You have the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, which was constructed in 1833, the rebuilding, that is rebuilding of Mint, the commissariat building. There were many buildings also which were constructed. And another important was that by 1800, most of the public buildings, they had this revenue department building, marine department building, and so on. So all these buildings were in a dilapidated state, so which required urgent repairs. So repairs also took a toll on the forest of Western India, you find. So most of the trees which were, so annual repairs the building, the construction of building, and the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so this is how I managed to get from the archives. This is the plan for the next, carving. So this is one of the most important industry which was established in the 19th century, the carved furniture and the sadeli, that is inlaid work. Now, if you see this carved, next slide, wood carving, next slide. Yeah, so wood carving industry. Wood carving in Bombay was an imported industry, because with the decline in Surat, you find merchants and as well as also the carpenters began to migrate to Bombay. So most of the people who were employed in this industry were from Ahmedabad and Surat, who had migrated to Bombay. And there were several workshops producing this furniture, which was located in Bombay, that is around the Meadow Street in Bombay, the area popularly known as the Angrez Bazaar. Due to the English shops in the vicinity, a variety of furniture was made of Blackwood, jackwood, and teak. And the types of furniture which was manufactured were chairs, bed, couches, wardrobe, desks, cabinets. So next, uh, now these are the prices of the Blackwood furniture in the mid 19th century, and why I'm talking about the mid 19th century and how this. So the furniture industry, it's basically catering to the local clientele, the rich, the elites. The most of them were Parsi, the Gujarati, that is Mangaldas Nathubai and the others. They decorated their houses with this carved furniture. And by 1851, the first international exhibition was held in England, and this international exhibition where they had to display the crafts, so which was crafts exhibition. And certainly when it comes to crafts, India was known for its beautiful crafts. So craft furniture was displayed, Sadeli was displayed, and believe me, in no time, in that time the exhibitions used to go in for months. And in no time, in a 2 days time, all this carved furniture which was displayed were all sold off. So you see the transnational trade, it's a oceanic trade which is taking place all over the world. So local knowledge and the global market you find, and because of the market which increased, you see that the demand for this Blackwood furniture was so much that Lockwood Day Forest from America. So there were many foreign visitors. So you have American, the French, the Asians all visiting the exhibitions. And they were so enamored by this Blackwood furniture that Lockwood Day Forest, when he gets married, he sets up a company in Gujarat with in collaboration with Hatti Singh, the Blackwood, that is the carving industry, and he becomes an agent to supply the furniture to America. In fact, one of the richest man in New York constructed his house made of teak, as well as decorated his houses with this furniture, and he was able to amass a lot of wealth. So when he got married, Lockwood Day Forest, he comes to India for his honeymoon with his wife, and he visits all these crafts, and he's so enamored by this, especially Blackwood furniture, that you see that since the rise of Bombay is the decline of Surat, so you see the revival of this Blackwood furniture industry also in Surat and Ahmedabad. And in Ahmedabad, he sets up this company. And not only that, so if you see the next slide, yeah, yeah. So even the Sultan of Zanzibar, okay, before this, the Sultan of Zanzibar also came to Bombay and to purchase the sofa. If you've seen my earlier slide, yeah, he came to Bombay and he bought the particular sofa in 1860 or so and took it to Zanzibar. So this furniture went global, not only to America, to Britain, to France, but to Sri Lanka, to the Arab world, and everywhere, to Zanzibar and so on. So that was so you can, I'm just linking up to how you can see the pressure on the Blackwood trees which were being cut, because you find companies being set up later on, and the roaring business being made as far as this Bombay boxes, it was called handsome boxes. And Sadeli was another thing which was like the inlaid work, which was introduced in Bombay and by the Multan artisans, and they are the decorated type of boxes. So there were so many masters and 75 apprenticeships in Bombay, and a variety of articles were prepared. Next. So the civic construction and shipbuilding, both commercial ships, which was commercial passengers or maybe for the warships, you find certainly postulated the first phase of deforestation. You have the years between 1807 to 1823 marked a high point in companies' monopoly in timber for shipbuilding and civic construction. So the immediate impact of this was extraction of timber from the forest of Malabar, Karnataka, Travancore, Konkan, Gujarat, which led to the denudation of forests, especially those mushroomed around the riverbank terrains were more vulnerable to such gratuitous plucking. So we come to the next, that is phase of deforestation, that is the end of the timber monopoly. So as I mentioned that the policies of the government certainly had affected the merchants, the traders, the people. So with the fear of social unrest, not only the fear of social unrest, also this is the period where the British officials are under the influence of the French physiocrats who talks about the free trade, Adam Smith's free trade. The more the free trade, the better is the profit. And so you find they abolished the post of the conservator of the forest, and that's how the monopoly ends. But the end of monopoly led to more devastation of the forest of Malabar and Kannada. There was unrestricted felling encouraged by the timber agency, which made large advances to native contractors to provide timber. And this finally led to severe famine virtually in timber. Next slide. Uh, Next slide. So this is what I got from the archive, that before the statistical figures, that if you see here, see 1807, the timber that was supplied was to the tune of rupees 31,124. By the time it is 1823, at the end, it is 1,08,000. But after 1823, the abolition of timber, this is the statistical figure you get. It's 1,74,000, then 2 lakh, 4 lakh, 4 lakh, and it went on increasing. Of course, the another reason also is, since river was very important for transporting, so many a time due to famines and due to failure of monsoons, many a time they were not able to navigate this particular timber to Bombay, and the prices also escalated. Next. Next. Yeah, and so what you see is that since timber, it's a demand and supply theory. So since the timber became less and less and less, if you see the statistical figure, which shows that in 1856, the superior quality timber was 18. In 1836, 37, 20, and 1837, 38, it increased to 27. And the same thing happened with the plants. The first sort 40, 45, 55. So you can, this indicates the extent of what you can say the deforestation of Western India. Next. Next. Yeah. So, you find that even before the establishment of the railways, back please. Even before the establishment of the railways, you find that after the end of the timber monopoly, you find with this privatization of trade led to more felling of the trees as such. And what you see is that the scientists as well as the superintendent botanical gardens and all, they kept on informing the government that it's high time that we need to regulate the forest. We need to come up with some measures to conservation measures to conserve the forest. Otherwise, we will fall short of timber, and then we'll have to import the timber, which will be far more expensive. But it really fell on deaf ears, because only in 1847, the British somehow manages then to establish the pioneering department, that is 1847, where Alexander Gibson becomes the superintendent and the forest department conservator. Okay, so he becomes the conservator of the Bombay Presidency department. But once again, the the government is not ready to spend enough money on the development on this department. The number of personnel that he has are very few. So you can imagine the role of the conservator is now to supply timber, but at the same time conserve the forest. And so it's a dubious role which he had to manage and balance between the two. And therefore you find the conservation programs to begin with, but due to paucity of time, not able to go into it. I will talk about the last phase of deforestation, that is establishment and extension of the railway in Bombay and Bombay Presidency. So by the mid of the 18th century, 19th century, those ships you find had stopped. Ships were made of iron, because due to the scarcity of timber, Jahangir, one of the descendant of Lauji, was sent to England. He stayed there for 3 years to learn how ships should be manufactured of iron. And believe me, in 1840, the first steamship, that is the iron ship, was constructed by the Parsi builders in Bombay. So although ship was constructed of iron, but it did not stop deforestation, because you see that it's the beginning of the railways, and it is basically because of the building of the railways, which Lord Dalhousie had justified in a minute the need for commercial as well as from strategic point of view. And especially after the revolt of 1857, the British really hurried in the extension of the railway. So what you see is that the railways, because the railways started, the British now changes their policy when it comes to annual repairs of the building. They stopped the repairs of the building by 1850, and now their whole attention is on the railway construction. So when it comes to railway construction, next slide. Next slide. Now, two companies play a very important role in the construction of the railway: the Great Indian Peninsular Railway and the Bombay Baroda Central Indian Railway Company in the Bombay Presidency, which began in the mid-19th century. In 1853, the first railway line was laid between Bombay to Thana in 1853 of 22 and quarter miles. So what you see is that a vicious cycle of exploitation, okay, where history repeats itself with every new development that occurred in the urban city. So now it was the railway, and the whole process again repeats. The contract system, the surveys to be carried out. Okay, so you have now, it is again the contract system. Only the Bombay Baroda Central Indian Railway Company, they had a departmental system. So difference between the contract and the departmental system is the contractors themselves were the ones who supplied timber for the GIP, but in the departmental system, it is the engineers became the contractor. That is the only difference. But it took a toll on the forest of Western India. So now they began to target. The British had realized there is not enough timber, but railways are equally important. So what do? So once again, in fact, there is a debate. There is a big debate among the colonial officials as to whether it should be iron or whether it should be timber. And what they found was timber is any day cheaper. It is, though it is not so durable like the iron, but iron, then they had to import it, the cost would increase. So it's the cost factor certainly went in the favor of timber. So they thought we could manage to go into the forest, deeper into the forest of Malabar, and get this straight timber from Malabar and then target the other regions which were not targeted so far. So you find that a contract was signed by the directors of the East India Company and GIP, but they found that not enough timber was there. So you find that that's the reason why you find that every month when they began to construct the railways, every month the timber prices were increasing. So earlier it was in years and now it was in months. So if you see the railway line between Bombay to Thana in 1853 of 22 and quarter miles, 64,000 sleepers were required, comprising of, and now it was not just teak, but it was Blackwood. Now Blackwood is a little hard to work on, but they found, so James Berkeley, who is the chief resident engineer, he went to the forest, Gibson goes into the forest, and they again prepare the archive, for furnishing the details to the authorities about the timber availability. So that's how you find teak, Blackwood were used for mainline sleepers, and Erul was used for siding and station sleepers. So this is the statistics which I get where Clergon, who is the forester of conservator of Madras Forest, you find that Kerala Forest is, he gave this particular description as, if 7 sleepers could be procured from one tree, approximately you find 9,142 teak, Erul and Blackwood trees were cut for single railway line between Bombay to Thana. So you can imagine the extent of deforestation, okay? The way the trees were cut here as such. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so this is the prices of timber. Every month, the timber prices are increasing from 3.5 to 3.8 to 7 to 8 to 9. and so on. So unprecedented demand for timber escalated the prices. Okay, and next, I'm almost coming to a close. Yeah, so this is the extent of the railway company. You find how GIP company, they built the railway. So you can imagine so many miles and so much of timber that was cut. Okay, next. Yeah, so this was to be completed, but because of the shortage sometimes of the timber, they were not able to complete. It got delayed for that matter. So by the time the BBCI, that is the Bombay Baroda Central Income, started constructing the railway in the Bombay Presidency in 1856, okay, the GIP had already consumed much of the wooden sleepers. Okay, so timber was used. Basically, they decided for sleepers and for fuel. Okay, so there was a huge shortage of good quality timber for the sleepers, and therefore you find, next slide, they had to delay. Next slide. Yeah. So you find that both the companies trying to extract timber finally led to timber famine. And it so happened that the BBCI in 1860 was compelled to use the imported sleepers from England. There was no other alternative. In fact, earlier when they had tried, even when it comes to shipbuilding, and later on even for before they had conducted also a debate on iron or wood sleepers, they carried out an experiments of the timber from England, and they experimented with Indian teak, and all the timber from England was eaten up, okay, by the white ants, which was not so with the teak of India. So that's how the teak. In fact, the teak of Malabar was considered to be the best even compared to the Burma teak. Okay, and it so happened that because of the shortage of timber, find was compelled to use iron plot sleepers on the railway line between Pune, Solapur in the Thalghat to Bhusawal in Khandesh. And not only that, timber had to be imported even from Australia and Singapore. This was because, and you have so many merchants entering into this lucrative, because the trade became very lucrative. So many Hindus, the Muslim merchants, the Parsis were the main who were all involved into this trade, because it became a lucrative trade. It fetched a lot of money. So the price of, and many a times these contractors, they cut very small trees also, because it fetched a lot of money for them for ultimately. So the price of teak, imagine what it began was 6.8 per candy. Now it increased to almost double by the time it is 1860s. And therefore in 1860s, large quantity of timber was also, sleepers were imported from Malayan Peninsula. So you have first in the inland trade, you have the interregional trade, and then you have the transnational, the global trade, where you have the importation of these timber sleepers as such. And then they realized that its best thing is to have the iron railway wagon instead of wooden wagon. So there were suggestions were made, and finally it was accepted because there was no really timber. 1864, but whatever timber was available, they were procured all from young trees. So many a time there are lots of reports, which talks about how the timber which is used is not of a very good quality, leading to accidents and the timber being rotten. So timber, just not timber for sleepers, but also the repairs also put a heavy demand on the, because it would last for 10 to 15 years. And after that, again, the sleepers had to be replaced. Okay, so the next. Yeah. Next slide. So a last part of it, that is fuel consumption. I won't go much into detail because of paucity of time. Approximately, one slide before this. Approximately, one slide before this. 150,000 to 2 lakh tons of fuel was consumed annually by the railways in form of fuel, which amounted to 40 to 60 rupees per ton, leading to fuel crisis. So sleepers led to timber crisis, and then you have the fuel crisis in the 1850s itself. And you have the locomotive superintendent, he estimated in 1860 that they had only plantations of 800 to 900 acres. So how are we going to get the fuel? So you can imagine now with such strict regulations where the people are not able to have access to the forest as such, and they themselves were not getting timber, that is a fuel, basically the bubble and the jungle wood, especially even to cook their food. So certainly you find it had its repercussion not only on the people and the merchant, but also on the forest. And it is for this reason you find it is this pressure that they are not able to get timber that the British decided now they change the policy. So how environmental factor plays an important role in bringing about a change in the economic system, in bringing about a change in economic policies, in bringing about the policies towards the forest. So all the time, Gibson was the conservator, kept on telling, instead of administering the forest, what needs to be done is regulating the forest. And that's how you find the 1865 Act coming to place. So where they banned on felling timber from the government wasteland, where accessed or not accessed without permission, nobody could have access to this particular land. And it led to this act. So the first time you find you have Bombay Forest Department in 1847, 56 is in Malabar, and you have the all India level, it is the Imperial Forest Department where Dietrich Bandis, who became the Inspector General of Forest of India. So he was in Burma, and that's why he was called here. So what happens is the British were not trained forester. They did not employ trained foresters. There is lack of scientific forestry. So the lack of scientific forestry, and therefore it is not surprising that Brandes, who is from Germany, is invited. Okay, he was in Burma. He's invited to regenerate the forest of Western India. And you find Brandes makes it very clear that we need to have a better regulation, we need to have a better act. And therefore, the 1878 is the major comprehensive legislation of forests, which divides the forest into reserve forest, the protective forest, the village forest. So, but by and large, there was actual no demarcation. All the forests were totally brought under control. But credit is given to Brandes for regenerating the forest. I was able to have a very good map, which shows the afforestation and reclothing of the forest of entire India. So to conclude, I'll just conclude that British colonial state fueled the imperative need for building ships, warships, civic construction, establishment and extension of the railway in Bombay and Bombay Presidency. What you see is extension of the British power and centralization of geographical knowledge of Western India. It enabled the colonial state to maintain imperial communication, intra-trade, transoceanic trade, and naval defense. So ultimately, it accounted for British maritime and imperial strength, which depended upon the Indian wooden sailing vessels built of planks, beams, masts sawn from suitable trees of Western India at the Bombay dockyard. So ultimately, what you see today is the urbanization process of Bombay at the cost of deforestation. So you have urbanization on one hand, but at the real cost of deforestation. So I would just a short note that environmental crisis today has become a matter of great concern. In the wake of natural disaster, we have recently witnessed, as Dr. Louiza Rodrigues mentioned, at Uttarakhand. So we have disasters not only in India, but globally. And so when we look at ecological crisis from historical stance, there is so much to learn. We can avoid mistakes of the predecessors and improve, strategize, and guide future reform efforts. In this sense, what we feel is we have been, in the post-colonial period, we have been far more brutal than the British government. We have integrated forests with economic development goals, strategies, and progress. So we are following the same footsteps. And today we have so much of construction activity. Where is the wood? Where is the forest? Even the forest, when it comes to the RA forest, that also is, we don't know still now whether it will be targeted or not. Thank you very much for patient listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodrigues, for this wonderful lecture. And in fact, showing us that how, the environmental issues can actually affect, lot many things like economic policies, and it can have like adverse effects on us. And, we are actually witnessing what had happened even like in yesteryears that you spoke about, that how infrastructural demands and, demands from the industries like say shipbuilding, furniture, even railway construction. So all the infrastructural projects can actually put stress and, can lead to the appropriation of all the natural resources, and how actually it really monopolized the timber trade and led to deforestation. It was really a wonderful thing. So I would like to actually means thank you once again, and I would like to ask our participants, audience, to write down their questions in the chat box so that I can convey it to Dr. Rodrigues. There is already one question by Dr. Firoza Godrej. Dr. Godrej, would you like to ask in person?
I just wanted to know about the Forest Act of 1850 that you mentioned. Has it been amended, and how many times? I know it's beyond the purview of the lecture, but I know that there are a lot of people here who are interested.
Yeah, there have been acts. In fact, because of the, people began to, send so many petitions that they are being deprived. And if you see in the end of the 19th century is the famine which takes place, and you have the agricultural crisis, and in 1875, the Deccan riot. And so there is a commission which is appointed to address to the problems of the people there. And that's how you find the people. You find there's a mass volumes written by the people, by the petitioners, and saying that how they are deprived of their forests. So you find that 1894 there was this act which came in, and then there were several subsequent acts in 1924 and the other acts. But by and large, these acts have not. The forest is totally regulated by the government. In fact, totally. In fact, there are no such access. There were the problems when it comes to even the 1878, the grazing rights. However, if you consider this as the forest anywhere, where would the animal graze? So there are certain, the acts have been amended, but not in the interest of the people as such. Certainly not.
Thank you.
Actually, I wanted to ask you one question. Today we actually see there are like a lot of movements that had happened historically. So was there any resistance history when the deforestation was happening during the colonial period? And have you like come across the references for that? Any resistance by...
As I mentioned, one resistance was by the merchants of the territory merchants of Malabar. But they were not very organized. Most of the tribals also, whenever they revolted also, they are not very organized. Okay. And the tribal movements failed virtually. So there are movements, there are so many tribal movements which are going on in the 19th and in the 20th century. You have the tribal movement, so many movements as such. But as I said, they were joined by the Kolis and the others, because one of the reasons was depriving them to have access to the forest. So yeah, so that's how you find that that movements were there. In fact, I would say the movement was even carried out by the superintendents of the botanical gardens and the British scientists also. They kept on harping, saying that putting forth the desiccationist theory, linking of famine to deforestation as such. And even the British, even the Indians pointed out, when the commission was appointed, the Indian peasants and all, that the famine is not because of us, it's because of you. It's because you all are responsible for cutting up the trees and forests, and that was the reason. Yeah.
Yeah, there are two more questions. Charushila Chandan Shive, would you like to ask, Charushila? Or I can just read it out for you. So Charushila is asking whether the act was confined only to timber and deforestation or to the other forest produce as well.
Yeah, it was all types of forest, everything. So what happened is, in the 1878 Act, which was implemented, they demarcated it and they classified further. In 1894, they classified further the forest. Okay. Then you have the 1924, it is the national forest, this forest and that forest. But 1878 was basically the forest of entire West India, north, west, south, east. Okay, entire, and one conservator for each part. So northern part, southern part, eastern part, western part. Okay, so all the forests. So though they demarcated, saying that it is the what you can say as reserve forest, protected forest. The protected forest were certainly in the longer run were to become a reserve forest. And the village forest, certainly the Indians, the peasants, the people had access to it, but they were also brought under control. So actually, it was like Brandes said, unless you regulate the forest, it's not possible to arrest deforestation.
Yeah, before I move on to the next question, participants are also requested to fill in the feedback form. The link has been posted in the chat box, so please do give your feedback. So next question is by Rohan Navalkar, and he's asking, was there any improvement in forest law enforcement after the formation of Department of Forestries of Independent India? He also adds that India often has very ambitious programs, but failed due to lack of personnel capacity. So what is your comment on that?
So I did mention that in the context of continuity and change, we have continued to follow the same policy. See, even after we got our independence, there were certain other issues which required priority. So even today, we are not bothered about the environment. Imagine at that time. So what happened is, if you see the 3-5 year plans, okay, in the post-colonial period, they came up with Vana Mahotsava. What happened on this Vanamotsa? Which trees? It was the same commercial trees. If the British tried to conserve the forest, the trees which were conserved were only teak, babul which was required for fuel. And the same thing happened after he gained the independence. So trees of commercial importance were given weightage, whether it was teak, whether it was babul, eucalyptus tree, hilda tree, which would fetch. So we integrated with the forest with the economic development. And I think so forest based industries, the paper mill which came up, that had created more. The Manora Saur has worked a lot as far as the post colonial period is concerned. Yeah.
I cannot see if there are any more questions. So Jason, would you like to take over now?
Sorry for taking so much time.
Oh, there is one more, sorry. So there is Shashi Rekha. So she is asking whether, so she says that deforestation caused a scarcity affecting people, and this was acknowledged in late 1800s. So was there any concern over biodiversity and environmental aspects? And could you just talk about this, from a historical perspective?
See, as I mentioned that even if the Britishers carried out these conservation program, okay, whether it is during the in the early 19th century or even in the mid 19th century, especially after the beginning of the railways where there was shortage of trees. But what the British did was they carried out experimental plantations, and these experimental plantation turned out to be a big failure. The trees that were sowed, what they did were either eaten up or they were by the rats. And the British came up with a policy like, can you believe that? Okay, they wanted the Indians to take the initiative of plantation. So what they did was, okay, we'll give you 50 rupees reward to plant the tree. The people would take the reward and not bother about it. So that sort of policy was of the British towards conservation of growing trees. And that's why I mentioned it very clearly that it is this failure of this experimental plantation. They woke up very late, they tried to reclothe the forest, but it was a failure. And therefore, and that also only commercial trees. It's where Brandes comes in and he comes up with a scientific forestry. So when he says scientifically done of scientific, so broadcast sowing of the seeds and different types, in certain plains where nurseries were started. So he comes up with regeneration of the forest, and that's how he sets up a school in Dehradun, isn't it, for trained foresters? We didn't. So British certainly learned from the other culture, I would say. So if the British knew that they lacked scientific forestry, they learned from Germany. They employed the Germans and they allowed their men to apply for the civil services. And not only that, they made them go to Germany, they went to France, they trained themselves, and that's how the regeneration of the forest. Yes.
So there is one more question. Nandita Moitra is asking, what was the reaction of the native newspapers to the denudation of forests?
To the?
To the deforestation.
Yeah, so as I mentioned that beside the native, what the people's reaction was, the one thing what the British did was that they halted shifting cultivation. Now, I hope you're not shifting cultivation. The reason given was that by 1816 Bombay Presidency, Gibson passed a legislation halting shifting cultivation because it is giving rise to forest fires. So it affected the people per se in carrying out agriculture. And British in the beginning always looked upon the forest as an obstacle to agriculture. So they used to encourage people to carry out cultivation, okay, and so that they get revenue. By 1860, they felt that it is leading to forest fire, the timber is being affected, so they halted shifting cultivation. And therefore, you find the basic reason was to commercialize the crop, you know, to have coffee plantations, but it affected the people. So there's a lot of antagonism and hatred. And as I said, after the Deccan riot, there's a lot of writings of the people's representatives, the political organization, the Bombay Association, and the Pune Charvajik Sabha taking up the issues of these peasants as to why this has been halted, why the people are getting it wrong. So there's a lot of criticism, and the British blame the Indians. The British blame the Indians for deforestation, but because of the forest fires. But it is not so. Okay, because although Manorama Savur also talks about the trees ultimately not uprooted, it is the trees always, you know, it grows, it regenerates, but it had its impact. So when you keep on cutting the tree, they could never get a tree of that same height. So straight timber was not at all available. So it have people voicing their opinion, there's no doubt about it.
There is, I think, one last question that we can take. So I think you had briefly touched upon this, but Charushila wants to ask that other than Parsis and British, whether there are any natives involved in timber trade.
Yeah, there were so many. There were Marwadis, Amichan, Motichan, there were I have list of, you can refer to my book, the list of timber merchants which I have listed for railway contractors, the ship contractors, the list of them. All commentaries got involved, whether it is Marwadis, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Parsis were the main contractors. Okay, so when it came to Gujarat forest, before the debacle of the Peshwa power, you had after, so you find the Parsi contractors were basically involved in supplying timber from Surat. But from Basin, they again gave monopoly right to one person called Muhammad Qazi. Okay, and after 1818 debacle of the Peshwa power, entire Bombay Presidency come under their control. Then forests are auctioned in Konkan to have civic construction in Bombay.
So there are no more questions. So, I think we can conclude with the vote of thanks. And thank you once again, Dr. Rodrigues, for delivering this wonderful lecture. In fact, like many years back when I was reading Glass Palace by Amitav Ghosh, he mentions actually, how there was a rise in timber plantations in Burma. And, like a lot of, Indians from southern India, actually went there, in search of like employment. And it's actually means it's a, a very interesting, fiction written, using all these historical facts. But now I think after listening to you, now I have like the better context to understand even the fiction. And, I am reading the book. I should actually, say that I have just started reading your book. So I think there is like wonderful things that, couldn't be like spoken today because of the paucity of time. I think I'll find those jewels over there. So thank you once again. And I would also like to thank Dr. Mukherjee, the Director General of the museum, the Board of Trustees, and the entire staff for supporting us as always. And we would like to thank the Museum Society of Mumbai, the Executive Committee, and the Chairperson, Dr. Firoza Godrej, who always has been the inspiration for us, even for the team at the Godrej Archives. And special thanks to Jason. And we always have this wonderful support of the technical team, including Yashraj, Sanjana, Rachel, for always coordinating for the event and managing all the technical support. In fact, Jason like keeps answering even like very silly technical questions that I keep asking him. And he generously keeps answering them at any given point in time. So thank you for that. And finally, thank you, audience, because without you, this wouldn't have been possible. But if you're like interested in such activities and our talks, Here are the details of Godrej Archives. Please keep following the social media handles of both CSMVS as well as Godrej Archives. I think Jason will show the CSMVS details as well. And if you want to like keep yourself updated about our forthcoming events, please follow these and please note down all our social media handles as well as our contact details.